Net Wealth Investments Limited is licensed to provide general advice. Our podcasts are not tailored to any one financial situation and may contain views of our presenters which may not align with Net Wealth's. The guest's organisation and Net Wealth have an arrangement for their financial products to be available for investment through the Net Wealth platforms, and Net Wealth may receive fees from the guest. More information about Net Wealth can be found on our website, including our financial services guide and disclosure documents. Please seek professional advice before acting.
We need to think about the way we assimilate knowledge. The concerns and problems that businesses face will be in that knowledge if you're looking in the right place.
We are able to provide solutions to advisors and planners when it comes to building and establishing relationships with the next generation.
Those who can be reasonable cost but good on service are going to be the winners in the future.
That's my basic mantra. Investing generally is not complicated.
Hi, and welcome to Between Meetings with Matt Heiner. In this podcast series, NetWealth's CEO and Managing Director chats to industry leaders and innovators with local and global expertise. They discuss the latest technologies, business models, and demographic changes, as well as leadership lessons and trends that are impacting financial services. We hope you enjoy their unique insights.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Between Meetings. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our guest today, Dan Solin, who is joining us all the way from the US.
Very nice to be with you, Matt, and thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to your questions and to responding in whatever way might help your audience, I hope.
Given that you are over in the US and have obviously operated with advisors in the industry for a long time, probably not as well known over in Australia, if you could just indulge us maybe for a few minutes and give a little bit of your background and particularly what you're working on now.
I have a pretty varied background. I started out as a lawyer, and at the end of my legal career, I was representing investors who had suffered terribly due to the misconduct of their brokers. And I tried a number of those cases, and they were very gripping emotionally because people had lost all or a substantial part of their life savings to it was just blatantly unethical and immoral conduct. I thought for the next portion of my career, I'd like to stop the bleeding rather than be retained after it's already happened. So I became a financial advisor, and then I started writing books intended to help investors invest in an evidence-based, responsible way. Not that they wouldn't still need advisors, many of them after they'd accumulated significant assets. I'm a big fan and proponent of good investment advice. So I did that. After I did that for a while, I became a consultant to advisors, and I consult in digital marketing. These days, mainly SEO and AI related. So that's kind of a summary of where I've been and where I am.
So you've written, I saw 8 books so far along this topic. What are some of the key areas within the books that really sort of, I guess, have resonated with the advice community over in the US?
So it's been more my initial 6 books, which were on investing, were really intended for investors. And they were primarily intended for what we call over here Main Street investors, meaning just everyday Americans who had no idea how to invest their money. When I started dealing with advisors, and especially when I was an advisor, what I learned was I really knew nothing about how to persuade people to invest with me. I felt passionately about the way we were proposing that people should invest. And I was very frustrated because I'd written this New York Times best-selling book, and I was pretty well known. And I would have many people call me with very over-the-top compliments saying, "Oh, it's an honor to meet you. I love your book." But yet I wasn't able to convert any more of them than my colleagues who were doing the equivalent of cold calling. And so I took 6 months to a year off, and I wrote a book called The Smartest Sales Book You'll Ever Read, and I followed it up with another book called Ask How to Relate to Anyone, in which I just thought there must be a better way than what I'm doing. And so I studied neuroscience and psychology, and I read hundreds and hundreds of studies and came up with what's now known as the Solin process, which is a scientific-backed way to help advisors convert more prospects into clients. It always struck me as a great anomaly that advisors insist on reams of evidence to support their investment philosophy. But when I would ask advisors, what's the evidence that supports the way you attempt to convert prospects into clients, I would get that deer in the headlights look. Nobody had any evidence. And so I marshaled all the evidence, and the results were really very surprising. So just to give you a concrete example, I was still an advisor at the time. And in the 5 years prior to when I wrote the first of those 2 books, I had generated $55 million of assets under management, which wasn't bad, but it wasn't great given my relatively high name recognition here. And in the 1 year after I figured out that everything I was doing was completely wrong and contradicted by every psychological and neuroscience study I could find, I generated $100 million of assets under management. That's when I knew I had really come on to something.
When you think through that time, what are some of the examples of what you were doing that wasn't working and that you were able to change to get that significant uplift?
So what I was doing, which is what pretty much everybody else does, was having a core belief that what I was saying was much more interesting than what was being said to me. And it was very easy to be kind of in love with myself and what I was saying because the New York Times had done a half-page review of my book and loved it, right? So, and then it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And that makes you believe that when people say, I'd be honored to meet you, they must be interested in what you have to say. And the great epiphany was nobody's interested in what I have to say. They're interested in whether I can solve a problem for them. Everything I was doing was wrong. All the talking, not listening carefully, not asking questions, not asking follow-up questions, and just generally adhering to, well, you're obviously here to take notes, so just let me talk. And if you have a couple of questions, I'll try to squeeze in the answers. I should be embarrassed even saying that now because it was so uninformed and so uneducated. That's what I was doing. And unfortunately, that's what most advisors still do.
One of the interesting things you just mentioned there is obviously your profile gave you the credibility and started the conversation. How important is that credibility or was that credibility and then obviously allowing you to take that next step? Do you think you can jump to step 2 without necessarily the profile that you had?
So it was very important in getting the phone to ring because I was well known, so people would pick up the phone and call me. It was harmful to me in terms of trying to convert them into clients. So I would say anybody can do this. I mean, I spent a week in Australia maybe 4 or 5 years ago, had one of the best weeks of my life, by the way, with many of your colleagues who you probably know in Sydney and Melbourne, and preached this gospel, and it was very well received and accepted and implemented. So anybody can do it. It's actually much easier, I find, as an introvert, which we can talk about, but I find it's much easier to ask questions and listen, much less stressful than me talking and having to perform.
And are there certain questions that you love to open with that really get that conversation going and make customers feel comfortable with the next part of the interview?
Yeah, that's a very important question, Matt, because I think there's a lot of training out there that teaches people how to drive a conversation like a funnel. Start with certain questions, but drive it so that you get to the areas that you want to talk about. And I could never find support for that. The support I found was for asking broad, open-ended questions like, tell me what you'd like to talk about. Tell me what's on your mind. And then just continuing to ask nice follow-up questions, not trying to drive the conversation to anything in particular and being perfectly happy if we never talked about anything that was relating to me or my background or my expertise or my investment philosophy for the whole time. I was perfectly fine when that happened because I knew I would convert that client because everybody else was going to the whiteboard and lecturing them for 50 minutes and they didn't feel heard.
I know you've done a lot of research on this. There was a recent example with my children who I always find are a good way to test out new ideas. And I found that when they came home from school, if you asked them how was their day or what they did, and they often didn't have a good answer, or they would say good. Whereas if you asked them, what was something that you did today that was fun, suddenly it would open up a whole new dialogue. And that's sort of that next level down in the funnel that really then creates the point of conversation.
I think that's well taken. That's a point well taken. And by the way, my process works quite brilliantly on children. Children love me. And I don't say that arrogantly, but I'm genuinely interested in them. So I ask them a lot of questions. If a child came to me and I said, how was school today? And they said, good. I would say, what was good about it? Tell me something that you did that you thought was really good. And then I would just keep asking questions. It's amazing what happens when you do this. When you shift the focus from you talking to genuinely, in a non-manipulative, authentic, sincere way, eliciting information from somebody else. If you understand, which I'm not assuming anybody does, but basics of neuroscience, you know what happens to the brain when you're talking, and you know what happens to the brain when you're listening. And once you understand that what I'm talking about is chemical, soundly based in science, then you just reverse engineer all that whenever you have a social interaction. It's not limited to converting prospects into clients. That's just what I was interested in doing. In fact, the impact of my process has been so much more impactful on my life and on the lives of people I've spoken to than that. It's improved their relationships with their children. It's improved their relationships with their loved one. It's really changed all of their interactions, which makes me very happy.
And presumably when you're saying it changes the way the brain operates, or you can see it really spark if you're tracking it and lighting up when you're listening as opposed to asking or talking.
So there's something called a functional MRI, which measures brain activity in real time. And some very smart psychologists at Harvard conducted an experiment where they hooked people up to functional MRIs. And they initially, in experiment number 1, they just said to them, talk about yourself. And when they looked at the functional MRI, they found that the prefrontal cortex of the brain lit up in a way that was indistinguishable from the way the brain reacts when you're engaged in the most pleasurable activities humans can engage in. They were very surprised by this, so they did a second experiment where they said, tell me about yourself, and we're going to transcribe the notes of what you're saying, and you brought a friend or relative with you to this experiment. We're going to discuss the findings with them. When we believe that what we're talking about is actually going to be heard by others, the prefrontal cortex lit up even more. So without boring you with really, really technical stuff, they think it's dopamine or oxytocin, which are two pleasurable neurochemicals that flood into the brain. The brain is now flooded with pleasure. So I read this study, and I had been reading hundreds of studies and slogging through stuff, and I'm not trained in either psychology or neuroscience. And this was my aha moment. I looked at this and said, this means that I have the power in any human interaction to create pleasure or pain, because there are other studies that show what happens to the brain when I talk a lot and force you to listen. And the brain reacts in a way that's indistinguishable from when it's experiencing physical pain. That's my power. So now how am I going to use that power? I'm going to give up the pleasure of talking to give you that pleasure. And there are lots of benefits that come from that.
And Dan, you work with a lot of advisors over in the US and would no doubt have similar challenges to us where regulation can get in the way of a good conversation. And so there is a way in which I'm sure you prefer to sequence a meeting or even a process from when they first pick up the phone to call you or from when you're out prospecting to actually collecting the data that you need to building that trust. How do you typically work with firms or advisors to really optimize for that process?
So my concern, I break it down into two pieces, before you're retained and after you're retained. I'm not familiar with the laws of Australia, but over here, before you're retained, you can have any kind of conversation you want as long as it's not misleading in any way. So following my process, I teach that because advisors want to improve their conversion rates. Once the client says, I'm on board. I like you, Matt. I like you. I think you understand me. I think my spouse or partner would like you. So sign me up. Once you're signed up, you now go into the meeting that I think you're referring to, which is you have to know your client in order to give advice. Mm-hmm. And then the way we do that is we say, would it be all right with you if I downloaded some information from you, which I'm going to need to put together an investment policy statement? And that's how we do it. But I'm always asking. I don't just assume. And I don't send them, I don't recommend sending them papers to fill out and everything. I try to reduce all friction. By friction, I mean anything that could impede the decision to retain the advisor as a client. I try to reduce all friction until you're hired. And at that point, you must follow all of the applicable laws. But you can get there by asking questions.
As you start to scale the business and you went from 55 million assets under management to 110 and no doubt beyond, how are you starting to use technology and leverage technology with that overarching philosophy of engagement and asking questions to get the information you wanted, but also to deliver at scale?
So at that point, that was like 10 years ago. So we weren't near there wasn't nearly the technology that's available now. So I would say I wasn't using any technology that I can think of. I had just changed my approach entirely. I mean, I just said, every time I meet somebody, I'm just going to ask some nice open-ended question. I'm going to listen really hard. And then I'm not going to assume when they ask me a question that I know what they're asking. If I get a question, how do you approach risk? I would say, tell me what you mean by, what does risk mean to you? Because I want to be sure I'm answering the question that you're asking. And if the client said, I'm very concerned about losing all my money, and so that's what I mean by risk, I would say, could you just tell me more about that concern? Like, where does that come from? After I have a full and complete understanding of what they're asking, I'm very happy to answer a question directly. And then I answer the question and then I say, Matt, did I answer your question or do you want more details? Nobody has ever said, I want more details. They want to start talking again.
I think that's a great process. And presumably by just changing that throughout every part of the offering, you're always looping back and just building on that relationship, and it gets stronger over time.
I don't want to oversell it, Matt, but it is the most remarkable experience I've ever had in my life. My only regret is I didn't know this when I was younger, because it's so powerful. It can be used for evil as well as good. Somebody told me that. I hadn't thought about that. Somebody read my book and said, this could be used for evil. And that made me very unhappy and stressed. I don't want it to be used in a manipulative way. I want it to be used in a sincere, authentic way.
Imagine a world where wealth technology is simplified. With Australia's #1 platform for overall satisfaction and value, you don't need to imagine. Netwealth is continually investing in new tools and platform features to optimize your staff productivity and to give you and your clients the best user experience. With our managed accounts functionality, bring new efficiency and scale to your investment operations. A world of technology awaits. Discover it at netwealth.com.au/woo. Rated by Investment Trends #1 for overall satisfaction by users from 2014 to 2022.
We often talk about the 5 whys internally. So if you're really trying to get to the crux of someone's issue, you have to ask at least 5 questions to get there. But that's always been on the basis of trying to deeply understand as opposed to actually building a relationship and lighting the other person up.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick story. An advisor told me this. A couple comes in, he does the normal talking for 50 minutes without interruption and then says, we're almost out of time. Do you have any questions? The wife looks at the husband and says, do you think he has enough time to talk about our special needs child? Because that's why we're here. This type of situation where people pass like ships in the night because advisors are making all kinds of assumptions based on all kinds of verbal and nonverbal cues is completely avoided with my process, because you are always wanting to find out what the agenda of the other person is. There's only one way to find that out, and that's to ask them.
Dan, jumping around a little bit, the first couple of books that you wrote were around evidence-based investing. Do you want to just talk through that a little bit as well, and then we can look at how it all comes together?
So I don't know what the investment philosophy of your advisors is.
Very broad.
All right. So I'm not universally beloved for holding these views, as you can imagine. But when I started writing books back in 2006, I was thinking, no plan is worth anything unless investors understand it and can implement it. So my goal was simplicity over complexity. In the book that went kind of viral, The Smartest Investment Book You'll Ever Read, my basic pitch was, there weren't ETFs at the time. Buy 3 index funds from Vanguard, you'll be fine. The total domestic fund, a broad domestic fund, an international fund, and a short-term bond fund, you'll be fine. Now in my latest book, which I wrote for millennials, I said, buy 2 ETFs, buy VT, Vanguard's Total World Stock Index Fund, and SHY, which is a short-term treasury bond fund. You'll be fine. Put them in the right asset allocation. Investing is not complicated. So that's my basic mantra. Investing generally is not complicated. It's made to be complicated, but I wonder what the real motivation for the complexity is, because I don't think it's better returns. I have a client who runs a mega billion-dollar advisory firm. He puts $100 million clients in a dimensional core fund and has done an analysis and believes that it gets better returns than comparable 10 and 12 fund portfolios.
And I think Warren Buffett's famous quote was, when asked what would you invest into, he agreed with your investment philosophy.
He did indeed, although his is a little more restrictive. He said when he dies, his trustee is instructed to buy the S&P 500 index fund for 90% of the assets and 10% to put in a short-term bond fund. I believe the S&P 500 is a little too restrictive, even though it has a lot of international component. I agree with many others who thinks you need more international exposure. But I agree with his basic philosophy, which is if you keep your focus on low fees, including advisors' fees, low cost, low management fees, and simplicity, you'll be fine. The less you do, the better your returns will be. That's what I preach.
Dan, you mentioned fees just before, which I know is a favourite topic of yours and has been debated rigorously over in Australia for many years around whether to charge an asset-based fee or a service fee. I'd love to get your views on that in particular and any other sort of, I guess, bugbears of yours that you're looking to solve.
So again, this is not a very popular view amongst my clients, particularly. Most advisors charge an asset-based fee. I don't understand why. Well, I think I do understand, but it doesn't make sense to me that advisors say, look, no longer is investing the major part of what I do for you. I'm a holistic wealth advisor. Here's a list of the things I do. I coordinate with your accountant. I do estate planning. We do a comprehensive planning for you. We do all these things. And we charge you based on the assets you have with us. This makes no sense to me. Why are you charging an asset-based fee for non-asset-based activities? It seems to me you should be charging some kind of hourly fee for those activities or a retainer fee for those activities. So I'm left with the rather harsh judgment that the reason an asset-based fee has so much staying power when it doesn't make sense is it obscures the amount of money that clients are really paying. And in no other profession is this done. My accountant doesn't charge me a fee based on the amount of taxes I'm paying or what my income was. I'm in favor of more transparency and kind of radical candor, and the asset-based fee doesn't cut it for me.
What's the trend in the US in relation to that? So I think your message certainly resonates and has been a driving force behind a lot of the advice firms actually changing to a project fee or fixed fee for the services they offer. Are you seeing more firms in the US converting, or is it still largely an asset-based environment?
I'm seeing more firms converting, and I'm seeing studies saying within 10 years it should be the predominant fee. But I'm skeptical. It's going much slower than I would have thought. When you probably know this, Matt, when you really run the numbers on what a 1% fee, what percentage of profits that takes over a period of time, especially when, as is the case here, I don't know what it is in Australia, they take the fee out of the portfolio, so you lose the opportunity cost. It's roughly 25% of your profits. So I wonder what investors would say is, do you think my services are worth on the upside 25% of your profits? And I also, of course, continue to bill you when the markets go down. Here's a radical view. If you're going to say you're a fiduciary and you're going to say you act in the best interest of your client, that does not seem to me to be in the best interest of your client.
And I remember having that conversation when I was in the US a couple of years on a similar study tour. And I think the fiduciary environment at the time was almost requiring an asset-based fee because they felt that was the way in which you best aligned to the client, which was the adverse of the conversation that we were having back home.
It's kind of I think it's ridiculous because the advisor has no responsibility for the direction of the market. I mean, really, if they did, they would take responsibility when the market tanks. When the market tanked in January or February this year, I didn't hear advisors saying, I'm going to lower my fee because I've always told you when you do well, we do well. But what I never told you is when you don't do well, we still do well. I just think we're way behind in our thinking. I'm glad to hear that Australia's ahead of us.
Dan, I'm conscious we're getting close to time. There's still a couple of topics I'd love to explore with you. I know that you're a big advocate for AI and some of the work that it can now do for advisors. Love to hear where you see it going and how you see it being best used by firms.
So first, I think advisors are largely in denial about AI and the impact it's going to have on the advisory business. I think personally, I don't know what the impact's going to be, but I know it's going to be seismic. I spend a lot of time studying and writing about AI. We do a lot of consulting on AI. What we're currently doing for our clients, and I'll just give you one example of how you can use AI in a way that very few advisors are currently using it. We create avatars using platforms like HeyGen or Synthesia. We create human avatars. We create voice avatars. So say you've written a book. We have that example of an advisor came to us. They've written a book, create an avatar for them, feed the book into AI, the entire manuscript. It generates hundreds and hundreds of transcripts. We take the transcripts, use another program, generate hundreds of videos, take our social media marketing team, deploy hundreds of videos over a period of time on his social media. Most advisors are still reading stuff like write content and hope you get likes. Okay, well, they're not going to be able to compete with our clients. Our clients are scaling in a way that they couldn't dream of doing before at a very low price. I mean, the technology is so good that the next step is going to be agentic avatars, without a doubt. We're working on a really exciting project. I haven't brought it to fruition, but where we can take you, Matt, create an avatar of you, have you on your website 24/7. Using a large language model, we can have everything you've ever written and basic investing principles in the large language model. Clients can access you anytime they want, ask any questions in an interactive way. You give answers. They'll set up appointments with you, get you all booked. You don't touch anything. It's just a 24/7 lead generation machine. And then the step after that is going to be clients interact with that avatar. The avatar has all the information about the client in its database. And the client says, Dan, I see that you're out of whack with your asset allocation. Would you like me to rebalance? You say yes. And it says, great, I just did that. Or the avatar, which has the whole tax code in its database, says, I monitor the tax code not twice a year, but minute by minute. If we did this and moved some assets from one place to another, we could save you a lot of money. Would you like me to do that? There are a lot of regulatory, ethical issues surrounding this, but that's where we're going in a nutshell. But it's not just where we're going, it's where we are. I mean, there's a lot that can be done now, and advisors who haven't started are going to be way behind.
And did you say you've actually seen advisors using that first avatar concept as part of their marketing efforts?
We use it extensively. It's a service that we provide to advisors all over the world, by the way. And we're creating avatars at a rapid clip. And then we're doing scripts, and then we're deploying them over social media, or they're deploying them over social media. Yeah, it's very effective. You can't tell the avatar from the real person.
In line with the conversation to date, have you also looked at how you're scripting those avatars to make sure that they're asking questions or perceived to be asking questions and not just telling?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The problem with doing that in a one-sided conversation is that, you can't get the answers. So this is coming because, as I said, the next step is interactive avatars. So this is particularly good for people who have like one point to make. I just did one for an advisor who did a short, effective video on what's the impact of tariffs on the stock market. It's great for stuff like that. Or, as I said, for promoting a book. Or it's also great for, you have a quarterly newsletter you want to send out. Most people, the data is pretty clear, most people are not interested in reading a lot of text-dense stuff. They tend to be much more visual, and video is much more engaging. The problem with video historically has been it's too expensive. You have to set up a camera or hire a crew, then you have to do editing and all. This is really cheap. I mean, we knock this out for $1,000 to create the avatar, do all the setup, review all the scripts, and we can knock off scripts for like $25 to $100 a script. We can do this all day. We have it absolutely down to an assembly line. This is where it's currently at.
And what sort of results are you seeing from those firms that have adopted the technology?
So I'd say too early to tell, but the data is that avatars, particularly with Gen Z and Gen Y, I think advisors should be very attuned to trying to lower the average age of their clientele. And we know that Gen Z and millennials interact well with digital media. So the data is pretty clear that it engages them more. And the data is also quite clear that most people engage more with video than with print, but I don't have any more firm, concrete data.
Dan, in a couple of those examples, and they make absolutely perfect sense, where does the human play in the future? Is the human still required for the upfront sales effort, if you like, and then it's maintenance mode, or where do you see the human playing?
This is a very vexing question, Matt, I have to tell you. Advisors will tell you, if you ask them that question, nobody can replace me because I'm human. And as a human, I can express empathy and concern in a way that avatars can't. That's fine, except the data is to the contrary. There's a lot of data now of avatars functioning as therapists. And there are studies on this. There's a voice called, I think, Hume, Hume. There's some studies on this that show that the avatar therapists are actually more effective than the human therapists. So we're not far away from avatars being able to express empathy. I think there's always going to be a role for advisors, but I think it's going to be a much different role. They're not going to be bogged down. It's going to be great to be there aren't going to be as many advisors, but it's going to be great to be one of the remaining ones because all their work is going to be really high level. It's going to be for much more complicated clients, and it's going to be much more sensitive interpersonal stuff because pretty much everything else will be able to be done by avatars. But there's always be people who will say, I don't want to talk to an avatar. I want to talk to Matt. And so there'll always be work for advisors. And again, I don't want to be presumptuous and say I have a clear crystal ball. I know exactly what's going to happen. I don't have a clue. But when I look at Goldman Sachs' study saying 300 million jobs will be replaced by avatars, what I say to advisors is there's no footnote saying except in the financial services industry.
Dan, what a fantastic place to stop. I'm not sure if you've scared the listeners or encouraged them to look a little bit harder at the tools available today. I'd be really interested to know, for those wanting to do a deeper dive into some of the things that we've talked about, where are the best resources and how can they contact you?
So my website's www.danielsolin.com. We have a lot of resources on there. I also answer a lot of advisors' questions without charging every day. And I'm always happy to be in touch with advisors to help them in any way I can because I believe in what advisors are doing. I think the vast majority of advisors are highly ethical, decent people who just want to do the right thing. And if I can help them, it's a privilege for me to do it.
I've got a few books I need to go and download from Amazon when we finish this podcast. Dan, thanks so much for joining. I appreciate it's late in the evening for you. It's been a great chat and hope that we keep in touch and hopefully get you back to Australia soon.
Thanks so much, Matt. It was a great pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Between Meetings. For more episodes and to subscribe to our series, visit the NetWealth website, iTunes, Spotify, or your favourite listening service. And if you want to contact me or engage or discuss any of the topics raised, please find me on LinkedIn or Twitter or send me a private message. We hope you can tune into the next episode.